because we have a fantastic session right here on the main channel.
Yeah, well, this goes to the idea of imparting ideas and how to communicate them. And this is, as we said before the video, based on a concept called the Overton window. What is acceptable to talk about in political debate? You know, very often we see ideas that were once quite fringe or even extreme become mainstream over time because the window of what's acceptable shifts. So we have three very, very good guests to talk us through how we can open up the Overton window and talk about all those terribly unconventional things that libertarians often have as their pet causes, not least of all myself. So we have Scott Heading, John Fund, and of course the legendary Grover Norquist speaking to us. Over to you.
Welcome and thank you to all three of you. Thank you for joining us on the 24 Hours of Liberty. I know that some of you have made it to Australia for previous Friedman conferences. This is, of course, a little bit different this year, but we're so thrilled to be able to have you with us. Now, I want to start with Scott. Start with Scott. Sorry about that. Just wanted to start with Scott and hear your comments on what you have on this topic.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Topher. Appreciate the opportunity. Yes, it's a little bit different than Friedman 7, where I know Grover and I were both in Australia for last year. So anyways, I just want to congratulate your team on putting on and pulling off such an amazing event. Our topic, opening the Overton window, is very timely. And as I'm up first, I think it's somewhat incumbent upon me to explain what is meant by the Overton window for those that are uninitiated to it. The concept of the Overton window was articulated by Joseph P. Overton in the mid-1990s. Joseph was an employee, vice president at the Mackinac Center, just a fantastic free market think tank out of Michigan. They actually named this concept after him following his death in 2003. The concept is that there is a range or a window of public policy outcomes that are acceptable to the public and, I guess, thereby their politicians. And conversely, that means there are policies that fall outside of the window that have a very small likelihood of being adopted by any politician, especially one in power. So if we take a public policy like education, for example, on one end of the spectrum, you have a policy that every child must attend a government-owned and controlled school, no exceptions. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you'd have a policy that government has absolutely no say or involvement whatsoever in education. Parents would have full control over how or even if their child received a formal education. And then in the middle, you have various hybrid options that involve both, state and private provisions, different levels of regulation. So the Overton window for education policy will only encompass a certain range of different options on the spectrum that are acceptable to the majority of voters. Depending on your country, that might be a very large window, might be very small, but it almost certainly won't include every single option. The Overton window also, I think, very accurately explains how politicians are not leaders, but rather followers. And that's not to say every politician is a populist, but if they want to be elected, they generally have to support policies within that Overton window. And my favorite all-time politician is the former premier of my home province of Alberta in Canada. His name was Ralph Klein. And Klein, I think, very honestly said many times that it was his job to figure out where the parade was going so that he could run to the front of it. Now, he was also a big deficit cutter, a flat tax champion, but he only did those things because they were popular. And they were popular because in the early 1990s in Canada, our finances were a complete mess. Canadians demanded change. Actually, my co-panelist, John Fund, who you'll hear from later, actually wrote in the Wall Street Journal in 1995 that Canada had become an honorary member of the third world due to our debt crisis. And at that time, even center-left parties were clamoring for cuts. The Overton window shifted. The window shifted so far in the early 90s in Canada that, I remember one socialist politician lamenting during this one election that it had become a macho competition between brutal cuts and massive cuts. He and every one of his party colleagues actually lost their seats in that election. So the thing about the Overton window, though, is that it can shift, it can grow, it can shrink, depending on the mood of the public. It can also shift in one direction and then shift back, or it can shift in one direction and never shift back. And I want to take a couple of historic examples from the Mackinac Center to explain that. So if you look at, for example, alcohol prohibition, it shifted from alcohol being easily accessible to being prohibited in the early 20th century back to being easily accessible. An example of a window that shifted and then never shifted back was that of the issue of women's suffrage. That campaign in the U.S. started as early as the 1840s, with the Overton window narrowly fixed around women not getting the right to vote. That one took 80 years in the U.S. to fully shift across the spectrum. And I don't think I'm going out on a limb here to say it's safe to say there's no chance that we're going to see that one shift back. And just lastly on the Overton window primer, just because a policy sits outside of the Overton window doesn't mean that we as advocates of free markets and personal liberty should shy away from them. We need to be realistic that when we push policies outside of the Overton window, we do run the risk of being ignored by the ruling classes, but we also need to remember that one of the ways the Overton window shifts over time is when we're able to popularize issues that weren't and aren't currently in the inside the window. So at my organization, at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we intentionally try to walk the margins of the window. We don't want to be so far outside that we're ignored, but we constantly want to push the window. And if we're successful, we recalibrate and move again to the margin. For example, if a government employee union is asking for a 5% wage hike for all their employees, while the government would be comfortable settling for 2%, we know that if we advocate for 2%, endorse the government's position, all it'll do is turn the middle ground into the final result. So maybe a 3 or 4% wage hike. So instead, we might do something like advocate for a wage freeze. And then if we get mainstream politicians start talking about a wage freeze, well, then we recalibrate. We start pushing for 5% or even 10% wage cuts, constantly trying to push that window. Okay, so now you've got the primer on the Overton window. I want to sort of get into a few of my thoughts on our topic of opening the Overton window. Well, I would say for starters, in many ways, that it is as wide and open as I've ever seen it. Both great and absolutely horrible policy options are now being openly debated. And this current pandemic has provided us with unprecedented challenges and opportunities. So let me start with some of the challenges. I appreciate I'm speaking at the Friedman conference, and Milton Friedman liked to talk about a negative income tax or a universal basic income. However, this policy has now been widely adopted by the socialists as an add-on to the existing social safety net rather than a replacement as Friedman proposed. Arguably, this pandemic has put the policy to the test, with many countries around the world providing either some sort of universal payment to everyone, a payment to a large cohort of people, or a wage subsidy to those who either couldn't work due to the economy shutting down or chose not to work. Continuing to extend these temporary emergency policies is going to be a disaster. I mean, already in Canada, many of those retail businesses and the service industry businesses are complaining that with the economy reopening, they just can't find workers to fill the jobs. Well, why? Well, the federal government is giving these employees in Canada $2,000 a month to stay at home. We even have the bizarre situation where in one province, the state government is offering $2,000 a month to anyone that goes back to work. So you have two different levels of government, all within the same country, offering competing subsidies. I mean, it's complete dysfunction. And yet, while I and other free market Canadians see disaster, our socialist friends see this as the start of a universal basic income. They're already getting column inches in newspapers to argue for making these subsidies permanent. I mean, 6 months ago, these people would have been ignored by journalists as quacks. The unprecedented spending and debt levels also have created a push for new and higher taxes. Again, in Canada, we got rid of our wealth and death taxes 30 years ago, yet now both of those issues are on the table. And if the opinion polls shared by our socialist think tanks are to be believed, these ideas are very popular. In fact, I would not be surprised to see either one, plus things like maybe changes to the capital gains, other niche taxes introduced in the next budget in Canada. Internationally, the movement over the past few years for governments to implement digital taxes and financial transaction taxes has provided both a challenge and an opportunity. We've seen in France, they've said that they will only delay implementation of a digital tax this year if there is an international agreement for multiple countries to implement the tax. And the French finance minister even cited how well many tech companies were doing during this time as evidence why a digital tax should be implemented now rather than later. We even saw in Poland, a new digital tax was implemented effective July 1st, so just a couple of weeks ago. So they're not slowing down there. Our friends over at the Tax Foundation have done just a tremendous job tracking all these taxes. If you're looking for more information, particularly on the side of digital taxes in Europe, I'd highly recommend you to check out their work. But I'm also, on the other side of this, I'm also encouraged by the opportunity at the other end of the window. Governments are actively looking for ideas to kickstart the economy. They can attempt this either through, the regular choosing winners and losers with corporate welfare schemes, or they can cut taxes. Again, in my home province, the government sped up its 4-year plan to reduce business taxes, slashing them from 10% to 8% overnight just a couple of weeks ago. Neighboring provinces are now feeling the pressure to keep up, so it would not surprise me to see others follow suit in the next few months. And while it's a much smaller scale, governments are also, they seem open to reducing taxes on things that will help fight the pandemic. We saw early on in the pandemic, in fact, our investigative journalist helped discover that the Canadian government was still charging an 18% tariff on all imported personal protective equipment like medical masks. We blew the whistle on this, and within a couple of weeks, the government had moved swiftly, swiftly relative to how slow government normally works, to remove these tariffs. The pandemic and push for government employees to work from home or not work at all has also put the role and the size of government into the Overton window. We found out this week that 27% of Canadian federal government staff took paid leave from mid-March at least through the end of May, possibly longer. And to be clear, these were not people who were just working from home. They simply had to claim they were unequipped to work from home, had childcare issues, or lived with someone with health concerns, and then they were paid to do nothing. Now, I think this is fantastic news. I mean, clearly, if government can launch dozens of new programs, spend a record amount of money during a health pandemic with only 73% of their staff still working, and let's be clear, a bunch of them were only sort of working from home. Well, this certainly means we can manage with at least 27% less government employees, probably much fewer. 6 months ago, we would have had a very tough time getting traction on a call to cut the government by 27%. Today, it's in the window. One more great opportunity is on the regulatory side. And I know that Grover and ATR have been doing a lot of excellent work on this in the United States. And if he doesn't talk about it during his section, I would suggest you want to ask about this during the Q&A. Our friends also at the UK Taxpayers Alliance also been working on this issue. They recently proposed 20 regulations they think should be relaxed. So if you're in the UK, check that out. In Canada, secondstreet.org, a new think tank started by my predecessor, has been keeping tabs on all the regulations that were temporarily relaxed because of COVID. I won't go through all of them, but some of the regulations that were dropped have given citizens the ability to renew their medical prescription without having to book a doctor's appointment, renew their driver's license online, file court documents electronically, and even order cocktails to go from restaurants. So interestingly, secondstreet.org also did some public opinion polling that found that while most Canadians felt the government had the right number of regulations, when they were presented with 10 examples of regulations that were relaxed during COVID, including the ones I mentioned, every single one of them had popular support to be extended post-COVID. So it's not all opportunity though when it comes to government regulations. As we've heard, if you tuned into the kibbies on the first session of the conference, we've seen new regulations being brought in the name of health and safety that are being implemented daily. Personal liberty, economic welfare, both at risk if these regulations go too far or stay too long. So in closing, I would implore you, my fellow lovers of liberty, to play both a good offense and a good defense over this next year. Governments are not going to sit idle, and our opponents are not going to sit idle either. They will not waste this crisis. So we need to be prepared to take them on and fight fights that we may have thought were dead and buried 6 months ago. But we also need to take the lead and push the Overton window further. Don't be afraid to propose solutions that you might have thought were too extreme just 6 months ago. You will be surprised just how open the public is to radical reforms right now. So thank you for your time. Thank you, Topher. I will turn it back over, and I'm looking forward to hearing our other speakers.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for that. And that's an interesting perspective. I would have thought in the era of cancel culture and media hysteria, the Overton window has been slammed shut. But you're right, there's a smorgasbord of ideas, good, bad, and ugly for us to choose from. And we have to continue just to push it out. And I'm no stranger to putting unpopular ideas out there into the ether and watching what happens. It's a sort of hobby of mine. But it's my great honour now to throw over to somebody who's probably been fighting for freedom as long as I've been alive, Grover Norquist. I myself had the pleasure of going to one of his legendary morning meetings 10 odd years ago. I think you did as well, Toby, once upon a time.
More recently, Washington, D.C.
Yeah, correct. You know the drill. So, Grover, over to you.
Grover, I think your mic might still be muted at the moment.
Okay.
There we go. Now we've got you.
Good. The Overton window has widened, and there's some tremendous opportunities to advance liberty that have been strengthened by the reaction to COVID. Just recently in the United States, school choice is a particularly important victory. Schools are half of state budgets. Schools are a great percentage of the government employment, and schools are really poorly run because they're run by government monopolies that are unionized and bureaucratized. So there's not only a big expense, but a big damage to the economy. In 1983, many years ago, I went to one of those retreats that Newt Gingrich would put together with about 20 or 30 of the most active Republican conservative congressmen. And so a guy's willing to spend a weekend thinking dangerous thoughts, getting rid of the death tax, going to a gold standard, cutting edge thinking. And one group said, I think we should talk about school choice. And a very prominent conservative Republican congressman still involved in politics today said, if you're going to talk about school choice in this room, I am going to have to leave. Okay. That is how poisonous there's no press there. He just couldn't and he wasn't agreeing with it. He wasn't going to, I'm secretly with you, but don't tell anyone. He said, no, he could not be in the room where school choice was discussed. Today, it is a consensus position, radical school choice for Republican officials. And we've seen with COVID two really big steps forward. First of all, 35 years ago, homeschooling was illegal in 48 states. Go to jail, illegal. It is now legal in all 50 states, and they win all the spelling bees, and people know, and singing honors and so on. But now, we just had a Supreme Court decision that the Blaine Amendment, which was designed to ban any state tax money going to Catholic schools, rather bigoted purpose in mind in what they were doing, has been largely struck down or limited by a Supreme Court decision. And we've seen with homeschooling, everybody in the country just about homeschooled for the last 3-4 months. They know what it means to work on a computer and work with your kids in school. And the number of people, about 30 to 40% of people who've done this said, I'm very interested in homeschooling myself. Now, they may decide that that's too much of a sacrifice, but they are much more open to becoming homeschoolers or to politically supporting the 2 million kids who homeschool right now. Any fraction of the 30% of people in the country who join the homeschoolers would double or triple the number of homeschoolers pretty quickly. The other, which is a threat and a competitor to public schools. The other threat to universities is online learning. Online learning has generally been thought of as sort of a step below community colleges. You didn't really go to university, you went to a community college. You didn't really go to a community college, you did online university from some school. So you got your certificate working online, you never had the nice dormitory and went to the college. We now have Harvard and every major university in America had online learning for an entire semester. Harvard's going to do it for another year. And they announced at Harvard, the cost of tuition will not go down by a penny, which means Harvard has told the world that learning online is every bit as effective as going and listening to 400,000 a year professors at Harvard. How do you walk that back for the younger brothers and sisters of people who have watched? They paid $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year to go to college, and you can do this for a fraction. Starbucks is now making this available to all of their baristas who've been for a couple of years. So the options and the desirability and people's comfort level is much greater. We've seen something similar to that with when people talk about, could you privatize Social Security? That was kind of a scary question in the 1960s when 10% of Americans owned shares of stock and were invested in the stock market. Today, 80 million Americans have a 401k or an IRA, a lifetime savings, in the stock market, and they've seen it go up. They've seen good times and bad times, and they realize that bad times do not end the value of your life savings. They come back up again over time. And so thinking about dramatically expanding defined contribution pensions, which are happening in the 50 states. Federal government's done it for the military now. You join the military, you get a 401k. And if you get a promotion in the military, you move into the 401k, defined benefit plan, not the defined contribution plan. So we've been, as more people do it outside of government, people get used to that freedom of owning your own pension, and then it moves into the government doing it. Utah is a state about 7 years ago said all new hires, cops, firemen, everybody has now got, state puts in 10% to your personal account, you put in 10%, and we're done. You walk out the door, that's yours. We're not going to come back in 12 years and tell you we forgot to fund your pension. We're not going to let you come back in 12 years and say, I want more. Okay, so we have no unfunded liabilities. On crime and drugs, Newt Gingrich used to always say crime and drugs as if they were the same thing. The criminal justice reform movement, which has continued through the whole issue of COVID, is we're letting more, who do you let out of prison if being in prison makes you susceptible to COVID? Who's safe to let out? How many people do you need in prison? For how long? We're making the distinction between victimless crimes where you hurt yourself, drugs, and crimes where you steal a car or you cut someone with a knife. And distinguishing between those, one is a crime, and you can go to jail for that, and the other is not. The 8 states during this recent period have banned the use of taking away your driver's license because you owe parking tickets or speeding tickets. They used to use that. It's like, what is the thing the British used to do is put you in debtor's prison. You owe money, they put you in prison. How am I supposed to get out of prison? How do I pay my debts if I can't earn money? Okay, well, taking away somebody's driver's license, which most states still do, but there's now federal legislation that's moving across the states to end this process, is a debtor's prison. It's home confinement because you can't drive out of your house to go get a job, to keep your job, to work a job legally. If you go and do it and they catch you, it's a felony, for crying out loud. So this lightening up has continued to move. And in Ferguson, which was perceived as a racial incident, a young black man was struggling with a policeman. The policeman shot him. And the president, everybody else said this is race. Turns out the problem they had in the White House, the Obama people gave me all the data they had, and they said, this is your problem, not ours. And what it was Ferguson got the city, 30% of their money they got from stealing money from people in fines and fees and civil asset forfeiture. So the police were the tax collectors for the city. So what? Everybody hated the police. Remember, Sheriff of Nottingham, not very popular guy. And so the police were hated by the community because they were nothing but people who collected fines and fees. State of Missouri, Ferguson is in the state of Missouri, put a limit on how much of that nonsense you can do. Not low enough, they're coming back to lower it, but that calmed things down because the cops weren't being tax collectors. The other issue that's moved also in the same way is concealed carry. The Democrats like to say if we had more gun control and fewer guns in the United States, then we'd have less crime. In point of fact, as 44 states have legalized concealed carry. I mean, you show up, here's my driver's license, I'm more than 21, I'm not crazy, I haven't been to prison recently, give me my concealed carry permit to carry a gun concealed anywhere in the state I want. We now have concealed carry legal in all states. In 44 states, it's shall issue. They can't ask you any silly questions about, well, why do you want one? They will in California, they will in New York, but in most states, the answer is, here is your permit. That number went up from 3 million maybe in 1990, they had 3 million. It's now 20 million people with concealed carry permits. So and you saw the gun ownership because of the riots and the demonstrations and whatnot, about 8 million new gun people buying, and half of them new gun owners in the United States. So the defense of the Second Amendment strengthened during this period because more people were comfortable with carrying a gun, with knowing that their neighbors did, and realizing that the more you had concealed carry permits in your state, the faster your crime fell, faster violent crime fell. They'll still steal your car when you're not in it, but otherwise they won't go into your house. They won't try and steal your car when you're in it. On tax cuts, COVID, the response to COVID, people talked the big spending bill. There was a bunch of money spent, but a good chunk of that was lower taxes. Some politicians don't see the difference between the government letting you keep your money and spending it. But this was a big tax cut effort to stop the economic collapse as that moved forward. On the bad news on Overton, cities have become the new labor unions. In the United States, the building block of the modern Democratic Party were labor unions, and they divided people by working class versus every self-employed farmers, everybody else, and they wanted to organize the working class in an almost Marxist way through organized labor. They were the funding source of the Democratic Party. They were the muscle of the Democratic Party. But since they destroyed many of the businesses that they got involved with, and they're only 7% of the private sector now, they can no longer fund the Democratic Party. So the Democrats shifted over to get stealing money from government workers with forced union dues from government workers. The Supreme Court said you can't do that with the Janus case. That's now declining. So what you see in the United States is mayors organizing political activity, writing Black Lives Matters on the street in front of Trump, political action through the state. They allowed some of the riots to go for a day in Chicago and then shut them down. So they actually can turn the mob on and off in their city, and even by where they put the police, direct where it's going to end up. Cities, I think, are a much more dangerous political opponent because they have the power to tax than unions were, or even stealing money from government workers. Last thought, the good news is that while many more young people tell you they are open to socialism, when you ask them, do you think that means the government would be bigger or smaller? About half think it means the government would be smaller. So on a linguistic level, you can't say socialist and everybody goes, we know that means Nazis, we know that means Stalin, because these people all went to public high school and they don't know any of those things. But what we do have is a population that is comfortable with socialism as a word, but they've not bought into the left's spending sprees.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you so much, Grover. One of the things that's become really clear just from the first two of you, and John, we'll get to you in just a moment, I've always thought of the Overton window as something that moves very slowly. It gets pushed very, very slowly. It's almost like a generational thing. Yeah. But listening to both of you, and you're both incredibly compelling and convincing, you've convinced me that this thing can move really quickly and people can change.
And I think the left has actually gone on that a long time ago. The left really does.
You're saying I'm just slow? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying we've all been slow collectively. I'm saying we need to move as fast as they do. As Mark Zuckerberg says, move fast and break things.
Now, John, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic as well before we get to some questions afterwards.
Sorry. Okay. Kudos for first putting on this remarkable international conference. You folks in Melbourne hit on something which is very important. I've often said the Overton window should be called the Overton shade, and here's why. A shade that you pull down, and you know that you can always raise it just a little bit. You know, you creep it up. But if you do it wrong, or you're surprised, or something happens, it snaps all the way up quickly, unlike a window, or even a window shade. And so this is what I think we've seen in the wake of COVID. And the left wing, and I want to discuss this because Grover left off with the fact that the public schools aren't teaching what people need to know to be good citizens. I want to discuss how the left has effectively used the Overton window to further their goals. They've played the long game. You know, at the end of the Cold War, we were triumphant. There was even a book written called The End of History. Liberal democracy was going to triumph around the world. And we were a little complacent. The left wasn't. I first knew the danger that they had not given up the centralized control goal when I went to a conference in Prague, then Czechoslovakia, about 2 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. This was the first conference where the left-wing environmentalists got together with the environmentalists from the former communist countries they had no contact with. And it turned out that it was oil and water. They had completely different goals. The people from East Germany, where they had ruined the entire country, mining lignite and coal, and torn up everything, were interested in actually improving the environment and making people's health better. The left-wing environmentalists seem to have a somewhat different agenda. So finally, there was this famous scene, I'll never forget it, where a Czech delegate got up on top of a table and started yelling at a delegate from Spain. I think he later went on to become a leader in Podemos. and said, I figured all of this out. We're supposed to be environmentalists here, but half of us aren't. I know what you're all about. You're watermelons. You're red on the outside and only, green on the outside and red on the inside. Now, that cliche has been spread around the world, but I think I was present when it actually took place, when the first articulation of that took place. So I thought for a long time with the climate change movement and with the environmental crisis of the day movement, that's where the left was putting its energy, and that's where we had to fight. Well, I was short-sighted and wrong. A lot of the left put their investment in the future in identity politics. We no longer are viewed as individuals primarily, but as members of a group. And instead of individual rights, there's group rights. And this is fundamentally against the rule of law that was established in the liberal democracies that we all admire around the world. The principle that people are going to be judged equally as much as possible under the law. The danger that we've seen in the United States and frankly other countries is increasingly groups are actually articulating and demanding that some groups be treated differently, either through special privileges or through special dispensations or other means by which we segregate out people by groups, and this encourages group thinking or group think, to use Orwell's phrase. Now, Ronald Reagan, and I know it's common to bring him up, but in this case, he really left us with an incredible insight that I need to mention. It's just over 30 years ago that he left office in the United States, and he had a farewell address. His farewell address is something I urge all of you to either view or read, because it was a very optimistic message. He talked about how, America's spirit had been reinvigorated, the West has been reinvigorated. He was speaking just a few months before the Berlin Wall collapsed. But he said, I have one warning to leave you with, my fellow countrymen, one warning. And it is, I do not believe that we are leaving behind an informed patriotism, an informed understanding of liberty. Quote, are we doing a good enough job teaching our children what liberty is and what she represents in the long history of the world? And he's specifically referring to the United States. He said, our youth were taught very directly what it means to be an American, and we observed almost in the air a love of country and an appreciation of our institutions. Young people learn these lessons from family, in the classrooms, and through popular culture. He then went on to say, today things are different. He was speaking in 1989. Parents aren't sure that an unambivalent appreciation of liberty or America is the right thing to teach modern children. Well-grounded patriotism is no longer in style. He said, after this warning, I appeal to you that we have got to teach history based not on what's in fashion, but what's important. If we forget what we did, we won't know who we are. I'm warning of an eradication of the American memory, of an eradication of liberty that may result ultimately in an erosion of our spirit and our freedom. And he finally concluded by saying something that he had said many times during his career, which is, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. The relevance of that to today is 30 years on from that speech, we have seen what the capture that the left accomplished of the public schools has created. It's only anecdotal, but every time I go to speak to a public school, the curriculum has changed. In most American high schools, civics and history are vanished, or if they are, they're told completely through a multicultural prism of oppression and how the society has been unfair to everyone, and especially those of a minority background. And of course, some of that should be communicated. And of course, the previous way we taught history was often too triumphalist and too ignoring of other points of view. But this rebalancing of history is not what the left was about. The left was all about obliterating the cultural, political, and ideological underpinnings of our free societies and transferring them to support for, well, their God is diversity. Their God is, we all are stronger together. and a bunch of catchphrases that are frankly both meaningless and threatening at the same time, because what they really mean is identity politics. They have flipped the window shade of the Overton window all the way to the top as a result of this terrible killing of George Floyd, because that was the match. That was the match that allowed them to flood into the streets and show the real power they had, that they had been hiding for so long. Because let's be honest, when Barack Obama was president between 2009 and 2017, it would have made very little sense with an African American as president to flood the streets and talk about how oppressive the society was. We saw the beginnings of it after Ferguson, which Grover referenced. That was when Black Lives Matter gestated and began. But the real problem we've seen the last 6 years is Black Lives Matter is not about Black Lives Matter. It's an ideologically Marxist organization. That is their own admission. The co-founder said on tape recently, "We are trained Marxists," and it is designed to subvert and overwhelm our society by disarming us through a false sense of communicated guilt and belief that we have to simply lie down and surrender, that we can't stand up for our institutions. So they have succeeded brilliantly in some ways with opening their Overton window. Now, what can we do to respond? Well, the first thing we can realize is we have to wake up. We now must realize that the enemy is at the barricades and we have not properly manned them. And we have to restore this with great vigor and great energy. And with young people, I think we have a much better chance than perhaps we realize. Young people are all about choices. And Grover referenced the fact that socialism is a word now that has gotten a general currency. It's warm and fuzzy. People think of it in the same way that you would refer to a social worker. It's become a soft word rather than the hard word that it was during the Cold War. But young people haven't changed. They want their iPhone. They want their Spotify. They want their ability to work from home. They want their ability to go to schools that are different, that can adapt to their changing needs. Many of them, of course, are going to go through universities in the future that are going to be profoundly different and much less reactionary in their teaching methods than we've seen now, as Grover referenced. So we have to appeal to the innate abilities and instincts of the young, which are against authority, against conformity, against groupthink, for change, progress, for choices. And one of the things we can show them is, under socialism or under even paternalistic government control, the choices you have in your life of what kind of jobs will be available to you, what freedom you'll have. Look at California's law, which greatly restricts independent contractors. That's an example of what the socialists have in mind. Everybody becomes a drone under a central authority and is shoved into a labor union or some other kind of centralized membership organization. If we can show them the complete dissonance between the vague, airy ideology of brotherhood and diversity that the left is putting out for young people and the harsh reality of what it will mean, we've seen this throughout history. Young people are socialists until they get their first paycheck and they notice the deductions and they suddenly realize, where's this money going and what am I getting for it? So we need to directly find arguments, methods, and approaches that can reach young people and tell them, you are once again being conned by the man. And in this case, the man isn't, some plutocrat. The man is a bunch of authoritarian ideologues who want to warp your mind into a conformity that is stifling not only of society, but of your own ambitions and your own future. And one of the things I've seen in talking to people, I just spoke with a graduate of a university last week. They are entering probably the toughest job market in history. Their summer vacation has been destroyed. They've been apart from their friends for 2 or 3 months. What if this continues? And what if the collapse of the economy and the further restrictions that we see in the reaction to this virus continue? Young people will be looking at what is, for them, a very bleak future. We have to be optimistic and we have to show exactly what your previous speakers like Johan Norberg and others said. We have to show them there is a better future, but it is through independent thought and our actions and ability to use our human capital as individuals to effectuate change, technological progress, and improve the future. If we don't do that, well, the mind-numbing conformity that sets in, there's a new version of Brave New World that's being airing on the Peacock network here in the United States. I'm sure it'll be shown in other countries soon. So it's not just 1984 we have to worry about, it's the Brave New World where then that was a softer dictatorship in which everybody was drugged into submission and to quiescence. And I believe that if we can open the window to simply show young people what their future is under collectivism, then we will have to worry less about them exploiting the Overton window more than they have done so far.
Well, thank you, all three of you, for your perspectives on that. I know we've had a number of questions come through.
Yeah, we've had questions flooding in. So there's one from my very old and dear mate, Rod Schneider, and Patriot to boot. Can Scott please share sources or examples of regulations dropped during COVID that you are campaigning to keep dropped?
Oh, you said this from Roderick?
Yes.
Oh, good. Oh, well, nice to get one from Roderick. So there's a few that, if you go to secondstreet.org or if you go to ATR's website, they've got, I think, and Grover can correct us, but I think they've got like hundreds now up there listed of different states that have dropped them. But I mean, there are ones like the ones I mentioned, such as be able to renew your driver's license online, be able to file court documents online. The ones that Second Street are campaigning for as well, such things as being able to take your drinks home with you when you order a cocktail at a restaurant. We've even seen some regulations dropped on the manufacturing of PPE. Like there was a lot of distillers were allowed to start producing hand sanitizer, and all the regulations were dropped right away. So, I think this is a better question for Grover of some of the ones that are going on in the States, but there are lots of examples. Secondstreet.org has them. So does the UK Taxpayers Alliance and ATR.
Well, that's probably a good idea. Let's open that question up first to Grover and then also to John. What do you think are the best opportunities for regulations that have been removed that we can actually potentially see never come back?
Sure. The complete list is over 700 now at atr.org,
Wow.
both federal and state. Allowing doctors to move across state lines and nurses and medical technicians without going through medical school again or having to fill out a whole bunch of paperwork, make it very easy to move from one state to another. I don't think that will be undone. Telemedicine, which you'd think we've had telephones for 100 years, that we might have updated some of our laws, but we only recently decided that you can do certain things over the telephone or over the computers, which are obvious. I mean, they don't let you email somebody and then the doctor 2 hours later email back. It has to be synchronous. Why? Okay. Well, that's one of the rules that they got rid of. So we can do an awful lot to break down in the federal system in the United States, the little cartels. No doctors are allowed to come down to Florida and retire and work 3 days a week. That kind of nonsense, because they don't want more doctors. And allowing, now doctors fight against efforts to allow you to do telemedicine and some of these other things, or to allow you to get a shot for vaccine at a CVS store, at a drugstore. You don't need to have a doctor there to give simple things like shots. So it's a lot of deregulation in medicine and also in liquor, which is the other overly regulated industry, because to get rid of the whole idea of prohibition, we had to give the 50 states the ability to regulate liquor in a way they can't do any other product.
And John, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that list?
Grover has answered that comprehensively, and I think we'll allow other questions.
So I've got a question of my own, which is, what do you see are the opportunities? And some of these have been touched on already, but what are some things that aren't yet inside the Overton window that you think might be ripe for just being able to push the boundaries just that little bit further? And I'll open the question up to all three of you, but John, would you like to take that one first?
Well, I spent part of my presentation discussing how the left has taken over the public schools. The flip side of that is the left is now trying to keep the schools closed. in the United States and other places. Because the teachers union, let's be honest, I mean, I love teachers, but long-standing teacher union members, lifers, they don't want to work much. So they like staying home. That's why they have such long summer vacations. So if they want to keep the schools closed, that is a perfect dichotomy between we who want to, with online learning and homeschooling and the other things that Grover mentioned, start educating people and in an entertaining, meaningful, substantive way that can actually make a difference in people's lives. Now, the reason that online learning failed for many people during the COVID crisis in the United States was it was run by the government. The government schools were directing their rigid top-down model of online learning, which they frankly hadn't spent a whole lot of time developing. There are all kinds of innovative approaches. You have some in Australia, many other countries have them, where look at the Khan Academy, which is used by many schools to teach young people about hundreds of subjects. What if in the future somebody went to these parents who are sitting at home and suffering under these government closed school guidelines and say, we're starting a Khan Academy school, sign up here. And philanthropy and public support for that through the private sector or even through the scholarship programs and the school choice programs in the United States can flow to that. So I think there can be a paradigm shift because the left, at the very same time they're capturing a victory, have also sown the seeds for their own defeat.
That's a brilliant answer. I'm going to leave that question there. We've got time for maybe one more. Have you got another one there?
Yeah, I do. And to go back to your point just now, John, on school choice. The name of the questioner escapes me, but homeschooling may indeed be a very effective way of not only saving taxpayer dollars but also wresting our youth and the next generations away from the hellhole of Marxist claptrap into which they become ensconced for the last 30 years or so. I know, Scott, you touched a little bit on homeschooling, but I'll throw it open to the panel. What can we expect in this area, in particular of school choice, going forward? As you said, because we've had parents everywhere around the world moonlighting as school teachers.
Maybe I'll jump in quick. I was one of those parents moonlighting as a school teacher. I think that there's been a lot of mixed reviews on it, but we're now much more prepared than we ever were. And if it happens again, or if we're not happy with the education that our children are being provided, we now feel a lot more comfortable. And I don't think we're alone. I think Grover talked about this during is that we've all had a taste of homeschooling. And even if a small group of people decide to switch over, it's going to massively increase the number of homeschoolers. So I think that, education, this pandemic has put education choice at the forefront of a lot of discussions that weren't being had before. And also about I think John's point about the unions, starting to really question some of the value that we're getting from teachers' unions and their ability to control the education system is, I think those are great outcomes of this pandemic.
Yeah, I think there might be a sense as well, and again, feel free anybody on the panel to comment on this, but I suspect a lot of people who've been at home, working, over Zoom to hold down their precarious job as it is, when they see the curriculum materials their kids come home with, they think, this is the crap they're teaching our children? What the hell? So I think this may indeed blow the Overton window in terms of education, such as it is in the Western world, wide open.
Yeah, the unhappiness with the public schools increases as parents, and I have daughters 11 and 12, and you see the nonsense that they're given, the poor quality of the work by the school. That makes you unhappy. Combining the understanding that people have of homeschooling works and work online opportunities like Khan University and others really can expand homeschooling very, very quickly. And when you get to the point that parents get together in groups of 2 or 3 and somebody does the homeschooling and 4 other people go to work, you've actually set up a private school with your friends, with your neighbors, with your relatives. That is what explodes it from 2 million kids to 5 and 10 million kids. That makes it much more possible because some people have to have 2 people working, or there's only one person one parent in the household, so that person has to work. Not everybody can take the time to homeschool. But if you have a friend who does, and you can take turns, you can create your own school, particularly with online learning. And then you just have to hide from the local politicians. Uber was a criminal act every city they went into. Right. They violated the law by setting up Uber. And they did corporate civil disobedience until the government had to give up in every one of those cities and states. Airbnb violated all sorts of rules because they didn't have rules for them. And they've been winning city by city, state by state. So the private sector where parents are defending kids, I think could see this grow to be so large that it's a political movement that the left, even at their most vicious, won't be able to shut down. 3 million kids in charter schools, a small version of this. The new presidential candidate, Biden, says he's going to shut them down. That's 3 million kids with parents who actually could really care. I mean, this election could be won with any focus on how radical Biden is on shutting down parental choice in education.
Well, thank you to each.
I have to go to another webinar, so I'm going to have to drop off.
Yeah, really appreciate you all. I do want to say, though, that that's exactly the progression that got my family into homeschooling. Yeah. I was actually homeschooled because my parents saw just how awful the curriculum was with my older brothers, and that's what that actually led to. We were one of the earlier families in Australia to homeschool voluntarily, and I think it's been wonderful to see it grow. I think it's one of the best things that my parents ever did for me. Thank you so much to all of our panelists there. Thank you so much for your time once again and helping to make the 24 Hours of Liberty such a wonderful success.